The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Windermere Palace as Princess Catherine stood by the tall windows of the royal chambers. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the last of Prince Alexander's uniforms into the leather travel case. After 15 years of marriage, she had never imagined this day would come. Alexander entered the room quietly, his military boots making soft sounds against the polished floor. His face carried the weight of the decision they had both struggled with for months. The kingdom of Avalancia was facing its greatest crisis in centuries, and the neighboring realm of Valdoria had requested his expertise to help broker a peace treaty that could prevent a devastating war. "The carriage will be ready in an hour," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine turned to face him, and he could see the tears she had been holding back all morning, finally beginning to fall. "I know this is important," she managed to say, placing her hand on his chest where she could feel his heart beating rapidly. "But 6 months feels like an eternity. The children barely understand why their father has to leave." Alexander took her hands in his, studying the simple wedding ring that had never left her finger since their wedding day. "Princess Isabella and Prince Marcus are stronger than we think. They have their mother's courage." He paused, searching for words that might ease her pain. "And this mission could secure peace for their future. Every day I'm gone is a day closer to ensuring they inherit a world without this conflict." The palace had been unusually quiet all week. The staff moved through their duties with hushed voices, sensing the gravity of the situation. Even the royal gardens seemed subdued, with the autumn flowers drooping as if they too understood the sadness that filled the air. Catherine walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where their children often played. "Do you remember when we first moved into these rooms? You said this would always be our sanctuary, no matter what storms the kingdom faced." "It still is," Alexander replied, joining her at the window. "Distance doesn't change what we've built here. Every morning when I wake in Valdoria, I'll see this view in my mind. I'll hear Isabella's laugh echoing through these halls, and Marcus asking his endless questions about everything he discovers." The princess leaned against her husband's shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent one last time. "The hardest part is not knowing what each day will bring. Letters take weeks to travel between our kingdoms. And by the time I read about your well-being, so much could have changed." Alexander lifted her chin gently so their eyes met. "Then we'll have to trust in something stronger than letters. We'll trust in what we know to be true about each other. Your strength will carry you through the difficult days, and mine will bring me home to you." They stood together in silence as the clock tower chimed 9 times. Soon, the palace would come alive with the formal ceremonies of departure. The royal council would gather, speeches would be made, and Alexander would transform from husband and father back into the diplomatic prince that Avalancia needed him to be. "I have something for you," Catherine said suddenly, walking to her jewelry box. She returned with a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. She wore this when grandfather served in the border wars. She always said it brought him home safely. Alexander opened the delicate locket to find a tiny portrait of Catherine on their wedding day, her smile radiant with hope for their future. "I'll wear it every day," he promised, fastening the chain around his neck. The sound of horses and carriages gathering in the courtyard below reminded them that their private moments were coming to an end. Soon, they would have to put on brave faces for the children, the court, and the people of Avalancia who were counting on this mission to succeed. "Promise me something," Catherine said, taking his hands one final time. "Promise me you'll remember this moment. Not just the sadness of leaving, but everything we've shared. The joy, the laughter, the quiet evenings when it was just us planning dreams for our family." "I promise," Alexander replied. "And you must promise me that you'll find reasons to smile every day. Take the children to the lake. Read them the adventure stories they love, and remind them that their father is working to make the world safer for adventures of their own." As they prepared to leave their private chambers and face the ceremony ahead, both knew that this goodbye would test everything they believed about love, duty, and the strength of their bond. The months ahead would bring challenges neither could fully imagine, but in this moment, they chose to focus on the certainty of their love rather than the uncertainty of their separation. The great hall of Windermere Palace had never felt more imposing than it did that afternoon. Hundreds of courtiers, diplomats, and citizens had gathered to witness Prince Alexander's departure. The magnificent tapestries that usually brought warmth to the space seemed to absorb the light, creating an atmosphere of solemn ceremony. Princess Catherine stood on the raised dais beside the golden throne, wearing her formal royal blue gown, adorned with the ancient sapphires of Valencia. Her composure was perfect, every inch the royal princess the people expected to see. But those who knew her well could detect the slight tremor in her hands as she held the ceremonial scroll. 10-year-old Princess Isabella stood between her parents, her small hand gripping her mother's dress. Her dark eyes, so much like her father's, darted between the crowd and her parents' faces, trying to understand why everyone looked so serious. Prince Marcus, only 7 years old, fidgeted with the brass buttons on his formal jacket, occasionally whispering questions that his mother answered with gentle nods and soft reassurances. King Edmund, Alexander's father, rose from his throne to address the assembly. His voice, though aged, still carried the authority that had guided Valencia through decades of prosperity. Today, we send forth our son not just as a prince of our realm, but as an ambassador of peace. The conflict brewing between Valdoria and the Eastern Kingdoms threatens the stability our generation has worked so hard to build. The king's words echoed through the hall, but Catherine found herself focusing on Alexander's profile as he listened. She memorized the way the afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the familiar set of his shoulders when he was preparing to take on a great responsibility, the small scar near his left temple from a childhood accident that only she and the children seemed to notice anymore. Prince Alexander, the king continued, you carry with you the hopes of not just Valencia, but of all the kingdoms that seek to resolve this matter, through wisdom, rather than warfare. May your efforts bring honor to our family and peace to our lands. Alexander stepped forward and knelt before his father, accepting the ceremonial sword that had been carried by Valencian diplomats for 3 centuries. As he rose, his eyes found Catherine's across the sea of faces. In that brief moment, all the formal pageantry faded away, and it was just the two of them, sharing a look that said everything words could not express. The ceremony continued with readings from ancient texts about duty and sacrifice, but Catherine's mind wandered to simpler times. She remembered their first dance at the harvest festival, when they were still just childhood friends discovering they had become something more. She thought about the morning they learned Isabella was coming, how they had sat in their garden sharing dreams about what kind of parents they would become. "Mama," Isabella whispered, tugging gently on Catherine's sleeve. "When will Papa come home?" Catherine knelt down to her daughter's level, speaking quietly so only Isabella could hear. "Papa will come home when his important work is finished, but while he's away, you and Marcus and I will take care of each other, and we'll write him letters about all the wonderful things that happen here." Marcus had wandered closer to his father during the ceremony, and Alexander placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. The little prince looked up with eyes full of questions he didn't know how to ask. Alexander knelt down to Marcus's level, speaking words meant only for his son's ears. "Remember what we practiced in the training yard?" Alexander asked softly. "A prince's greatest strength isn't his sword or his crown. It's his ability to protect the people he loves, even when it means making difficult choices." Marcus nodded solemnly, trying to understand the weight of his father's words. "Will you protect people in the other kingdom too?" "Yes," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And while I'm doing that important work, I need you to help protect Mama and Isabella. Can you do that for me?" The little prince straightened his shoulders, suddenly looking older than his 7 years. "I promise, Papa." And we won, every one. As the ceremony drew toward its conclusion, the reality of the moment began to settle over the family. Soon, Alexander would walk down the palace steps, climb into the royal carriage, and begin the long journey to Valdoria. The children would return to their lessons and their games, but with an empty chair at the dinner table and no familiar voice reading bedtime stories. Catherine approached her husband as the crowd began to disperse, giving them a few precious minutes before the final goodbye. The children flanked them, creating a small circle of family intimacy in the middle of the vast hall. "I want you all to know something," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Every sunrise in Valdoria will remind me of the sunrises we've watched together from our bedroom window. Every time I negotiate for peace, I'll be thinking of the peaceful evenings we've spent in our library, reading stories and planning adventures. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal. I want you to write to us about everything. Not just the important political meetings, but the small things too. What you eat for breakfast, what the countryside looks like, whether the stars are the same in Valdoria as they are here. And I want you to do the same, Alexander replied, accepting the journal. Fill your letters with Isabella's latest drawings and Marcus's new discoveries. Tell me about the changes in the gardens and which books you're reading. Help me feel like I'm still part of your daily lives. The palace bells began to toll, signaling that the departure time had arrived. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the carriage horses and the assembled escort preparing for the journey. The moment they had all been dreading was finally upon them. Isabella suddenly broke away from the group and ran to her father, wrapping her arms around his legs with all the fierce love a 10-year-old could muster. I don't want you to go, she said, her voice muffled against his jacket. Alexander lifted her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. I know, my sweet girl. But do you remember the story about the brave knight who had to travel to distant lands to protect his kingdom? Sometimes the people we love most have to be brave in different ways. Marcus joined them, and Alexander managed to embrace both children, while Catherine placed her arms around all three of them. For a moment, they stood together as they had so many times before, a family united against whatever challenges the world might bring. The sound of footsteps approaching reminded them that they could not delay any longer. The royal escort was waiting, and the diplomatic mission that could determine the fate of multiple kingdoms was about to begin. With heavy hearts but unwavering resolve, they prepared to face the hardest goodbye of their lives. The marble steps of Windermere Palace stretched endlessly before them as the royal family made their way toward the waiting carriage. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very stones were reluctant to let Prince Alexander leave. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and the distant sound of church bells from the village below, creating a melancholy symphony that matched the mood of the day. Catherine held tightly to Alexander's arm, feeling the strength in his muscles that had always made her feel protected. Now, that same strength would carry him away from her to face dangers she could only imagine. The silk of her gown rustled against the stone steps, a sound that seemed too cheerful for such a somber moment. The royal carriage stood gleaming in the courtyard, its deep burgundy paint and gold trim polished to perfection for the occasion. 6 white horses, their manes braided with ribbons in the colors of Avalancia, stamped impatiently as they sensed the importance of their mission. The coachman, old Thomas, who had served the royal family for 30 years, tipped his hat respectfully but couldn't hide the sadness in his weathered face. Your Highness, Thomas said quietly to Alexander, the roads to Valdoria are good this time of year, but I'll take care to avoid the mountain passes where bandits have been reported. We'll have you there safely, and back home just as soon as this business is finished. Alexander nodded gratefully, appreciating the old man's attempt at reassurance. Thank you, Thomas. Your steady hands have carried my family safely for years. I trust them completely with this journey as well. Princess Isabella had grown quiet as they approached the carriage, the reality of her father's departure finally sinking in. She clutched the small wooden horse Alexander had carved for her last Christmas, its painted mane now worn smooth from countless hours of play. Prince Marcus walked beside his sister, trying to maintain the brave posture his father had taught him. But his lower lip trembled despite his efforts. The palace staff had gathered at a respectful distance, their usual cheerful chatter replaced by solemn silence. Lady Margaret, Catherine's longtime companion, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Sir Richard, Alexander's trusted advisor who would remain behind to help Catherine manage royal duties, stood at attention, but his usual jovial expression was nowhere to be seen. As they reached the carriage, Alexander turned to face his family one final time. The afternoon sun cast golden light across the courtyard, making Catherine's hair shine like spun copper and highlighting the tear tracks on the children's cheeks. He wanted to memorize every detail of this moment, knowing it would sustain him through the long months ahead. Before I go, Alexander said, kneeling down to the children's level, I want to give you both something special. He reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 small silver pendants. each engraved with the family crest. These belonged to my grandfather when he was about your age. He wore his when he had to be brave, and it reminded him that he was never truly alone. Isabella accepted her pendant with reverence, her small fingers tracing the intricate design. Will it help me be brave when I miss you? It will remind you that part of me is always with you. Alexander replied, fastening the chain around her neck. And when you touch it, you can remember all the times we've laughed together, all the stories we've shared, and all the love that connects us no matter how far apart we might be. Marcus stepped forward to receive his pendant, his young face serious with the weight of the moment. Papa, will you wear something to remember us too? Alexander smiled through his own tears and touched the silver locket Catherine had given him that morning. I will, son. And every night before I sleep, I'll look at the picture inside and remember the 3 most important people in my world. Catherine had been watching this exchange with a heart so full of love and pain she could barely breathe. Now, as Alexander rose to face her, she struggled to find words that could possibly express everything she felt. How do you say goodbye to your partner, your confidant, your dearest friend, knowing that letters will be your only connection for months to come? I know you have to go, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, and I know this mission could save thousands of lives. But that doesn't make letting you go any easier. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had finally begun to fall. Do you remember our wedding day, when we promised to support each other through joy and sorrow, in times of peace and in times of trial? Catherine nodded, recalling the young woman she had been, so full of hope for their future together. I remember thinking that we could face anything as long as we faced it together. We are still facing this together, Alexander said firmly. The distance between us is just geography. The love we share, the family we've built, the dreams we're working toward, none of that changes. I'll carry you with me every step of the way, and I know you'll be strong enough to carry us all until I return. The sound of horses shifting restlessly reminded them that the departure could be delayed no longer. Alexander embraced each of his children one more time, whispering private words of love and encouragement that only they could hear. Then he turned to Catherine, and they fell into each other's arms with the desperate intensity of 2 people trying to memorize the feel of being complete. Write to me about everything, Catherine said against his shoulder. The important negotiations, yes, but also the small things. What you eat, what you see, who you meet. Help me feel like I'm sharing this journey with you. And you do the same, Alexander replied, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Tell me about Isabella's lessons and Marcus's adventures. Share the palace gossip and the changes in the garden. Make me feel like I never left. They stood locked in their embrace as the world continued around them, unwilling to be the first to let go. Finally, Alexander pulled back just enough to look into Catherine's eyes one last time. I love you, he said simply. Today, tomorrow, and every day until I come home. I love you too, Catherine replied, her voice steady despite her tears. Travel safely, negotiate wisely, and come back to us as soon as you can. Alexander climbed into the carriage, pausing in the doorway to wave to his family. Isabella and Marcus ran forward, calling out final goodbyes and promises to be good while Papa was away. Catherine stood tall and regal, every inch the princess the people needed to see. But her eyes never left her husband's face. As the carriage began to move, rolling slowly across the cobblestones toward the palace gates, Alexander leaned out the window for one last look at Windermere Palace. The stone walls that had sheltered his childhood and witnessed his greatest joys now stood as a beacon, promising that home and love and family would be waiting when his mission was complete. Catherine gathered the children close as they watched the carriage disappear through the gates and into the forest beyond. The palace courtyard felt impossibly empty now, but she could already feel the strength Alexander had spoken of, growing within her. She would be brave for their children, wise in her royal duties, and constant in her love. And someday soon, she would stand on these same steps to welcome him home. The sun was setting behind the palace towers, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. As the last sounds of the departing carriage faded into the distance, Princess Catherine took her children's hands and led them back into Windmere Palace, where their life would continue with faith, hope, and the unshakable belief that love could bridge any distance.